So I'm going to talk today about chronic inflammation, and the reason why is that Australian public health is in really bad state. You're not alone. It's the same in Europe, it's the same in North America, increasingly it's the same in China, South America, in fact everywhere where people are eating a modern diet. And I had a meeting with a representative of the Australian medical profession yesterday who was telling me, he was a good guy, I liked him, how good the Australian health service is. He was going into it in great detail. Oh, you don't agree? Well, that's what he was telling me. And it is, if you compare it with other national healthcare systems, it's probably in the top half dozen. And I asked him, well, if it's so good, how come you have such a sick population? And I went through some of the stats, and you know this. 2/3 of adults are obese, a quarter of children are. 50% of Australians have a chronic degenerative disease or other kind of serious health condition. 1 in 5 Australians has a heart or cardiovascular disease. And 1 in 16, maybe, is reckoned to have diabetes. Actually, I think the real figure is much higher. It's almost certainly closer to 1 in 8. And I don't think your health authorities are measuring it correctly. And he said, well, we're going to get better. And I said, well, I don't think you are, because on current trends, and on the trends I see everywhere else, these problems are getting worse. They're not getting better. And that started a whole discussion about what is the healthcare profession trying to do? Is it successful? Is it succeeding even in terms of what it determines to be the main goals? Well, I think the healthcare business is astoundingly successful in terms of some metrics. Not so much in others. In terms of making money, it's successful, really successful. In terms of maintaining an adequate level of public health, it's a dismal failure. It's a comprehensive failure. And I think one of the reasons for that is that it's not really looking in the right direction. What the medical profession does is to use a pharmacocentric approach, using drugs mostly. There is room for surgery too, but a lot of it is about drugs, and a lot of those drugs really don't do much more than treat the symptoms of disease. They don't address the underlying root causes of disease, with the exception of the antibiotics, and as you know, we're seeing increasing problems of drug resistance in the antibiotic field. One of the problems with the medical profession and the way in which healthcare is delivered at the moment is that it does not address this core issue of chronic inflammation. And unless you've been living under a rock, something like Ayers or some other similar rock for the last 10 years, then you know that chronic inflammation is important, that it is considered to be deeply implicated in chronic degenerative disease. And for most people, they leave it at that. But we can take this a little further. What we have begun to understand now, not only is chronic inflammation important in causing disease, we have a pretty good understanding now as to what causes chronic inflammation. We've also got to the point where we understand how chronic inflammation causes progressive tissue damage and how that leads in the fullness of time to chronic degenerative disease. But most importantly of all, we have discovered how to interrupt that sequence and how you can take very simple steps. That's very simple, very easy, and above all, very safe, to step out of that vicious cycle. And the evidence that we have, some of which goes back to the 19th century, suggests that when you do that, your health prospects become a lot better. In fact, we have identified, my colleagues and I, at Oxford and Nottingham Trent universities and London universities, we identified a population of people who lived in England in the second half of the 19th century who ate a very healthy diet, who did not have chronic inflammation or type B malnutrition, which is rife today thanks to modern foods, who really had very little cancer or heart disease or diabetes or dementia at all. They lived as long or longer than we do today, but they did not suffer from these chronic degenerative diseases to the extent that we do. Not nearly the extent that we do. So I'm going to show you some of the machinery underlying this sequence of events. I'm going to show you what it is that causes chronic inflammation, how it kills us, and how we can avoid it. That's the whole point. And one of the reasons why we are seeing increasing health problems is we are, as a population, getting heavier. And that's not just true in Australia, but in all the developed world and many of the developing countries also. And one of the reasons for that is that we've become physically very inactive. We no longer walk very much or work with our backs or our hands. We drive ourselves around in cars and trains. For me, it's mostly planes. And we're desk jockeys. We don't work in iron mills. We don't make things very much anymore. Some people still do, but those are minority occupations. Most of us push paper. We work with data. We work in offices. We have white-collar occupations. So that's one problem. The other problem is we are beleaguered and surrounded by foods which have been designed to overcome our defenses, which do not satiate, but which have been formulated in such a way that they are almost addictive. In fact, this whole issue of food addiction is one that is receiving a great deal of interest at the moment in the clinical and the scientific communities. There are journals of food addiction, and a lot of research indicates that the current generation of processed foods have been designed in such a way that they are effectively addictive. They're also artificially cheap, widely available, very convenient. So we eat a lot of these foods and they're full of calories. We eat too much of them because they do not satiate. So because of these reasons, not because we're individually weak, but because we're living in a culture that encourages obesity, we're getting heavier. And as we get heavier, we become more at risk of a whole range of different diseases. And we only have time really to focus on just a very few of these. I'll single out type 2 diabetes, which, as you all know, is increasing in leaps and bounds. It used to be very rare. If you look at a medical textbook from 1900, you will see that the medical community at that time knew all about type 2 diabetes, but it was rare. So the chapter on diabetes is almost exclusively about type 1, because that's what they saw most of. They'll have a page, maybe, or half a page about type 2, but it wasn't considered to be that interesting or important because it was rare. Now in America, more than 50% of all adults are frankly diabetic or have metabolic syndrome, which is the precursor to it. I believe the Australian data are in fact not far behind. And the problem with being a diabetic is it reduces life expectancy because it accelerates aging and increases the risk of many different kinds of problems, from cancers to dementias, heart disease, kidney disease, liver disease, many others. So we're seeing huge increases in diabetes, and along with that, other conditions related to diabetes, including end-stage renal disease, non-alcohol-related fatty liver disease, all of these increasing in leaps and bounds. And like diabetes, not only increasing in the numbers of people affected, but occurring in younger and younger and younger groups of patients, creating a huge and increasing demand for healthcare on a healthcare service which is already overburdened. Hypertension now affecting more than half of all American adults. I believe that the Australian figures are not that far behind. They're certainly going in that direction. And cataracts, less serious perhaps, but a huge inconvenience, a major problem in the second half of our lives because it's a common cause of loss of vision. Not only are we seeing more and more cases of cataracts, but we're seeing them occurring in younger and younger patients. In fact, the average age of onset has fallen by 20 years since 1950. This used to be an old age disease. Now we see it in teenagers. More common, younger and younger patients. This is a picture of a population that is being poisoned. And hold on to that picture because it shows through in a number of other disease categories. So these are diseases involving the central nervous system. Not only are we seeing a huge increase in the numbers of patients who are dementing, we are also seeing this same pattern of the age of onset of disease decreasing. In fact, the average age when dementia starts has fallen 15 years since 1980. And because as the disease progresses, it will eventually kill you, we're seeing huge increases in the numbers of men, 300% increase, women, 500% increase over 75, who are dying from these types of diseases. And we're seeing increases in the over 65s as well. You've heard, I think, the government's claiming to be concerned about the cost of healthcare for people with dementia. This is one of the reasons. But there is another tidal wave coming along because of the numbers of increasing for depression as well. Not only are the numbers of people with depression increasing, but you see the same decrease in latency. So the average age of dementia has fallen by 15 years since 1980. The average age of depression, when it first occurs, has also fallen by almost exactly the same number of years. And that's an even more of a concern, because if you have a history of depressive illness, you are far more at risk of dementia, because depression actually causes brain damage, we now realize. I know that there are some medics here, you know about some of the mechanisms involved, but there are many lay persons here as well, so I won't go into the detailed biochemistry. In the early stages of life, the neurodevelopmental disorders have also increased hugely. So this group of conditions, which are due to the fact that in the developing brain in the last trimester, in the first year of postpartum, the nerve tracts, which are supposed to go to specific places, don't succeed in getting there. They don't make the right connections. So the numbers of kids with ADD, ADHD, all of these types of problems also skyrocketing. Diseases of the connective tissues, osteoporosis, osteoarthritis, same trends. We're seeing increasing numbers of people presenting with these conditions. They are coming into the clinics at a younger and younger age. Diseases involving the immune system, asthma, and all the other allergies, and these are also allergies but involving the gut. Surprising the way in which these numbers have increased. So you think it's normal for children when they go to school, for 1 in every 4 to have an inhaler. That's pretty much what it is now. It's not normal. I went to school in 1954, and in this huge school of 2,000 kids, there was one boy with asthma, just one. That was our normal. And this kid, because we had no idea what asthma was, we'd never seen it before, when he had an asthma attack, we'd stand around in a circle watching him gasp for breath. Now, it's everywhere. So normality changes. Humans are not very good at detecting change if it occurs slowly and over periods of years or decades. We're adaptable. And because most doctors are ahistorical, they don't learn history, they don't really know very much about this. They think that what they see today is inevitable, that this is how it is, this is how it has to be. That is a huge and pervasive philosophical error. Things used to be very different. That's just one example, and there are plenty more. Cancers, which we are so concerned about today, you all know someone who's been touched by that. The frequency of cancer has doubled since 1950. And the frequency of one cancer in particular, non-tobacco related lung cancer, has doubled since 2012. This is a very dramatic increase. And it's not because we're getting older. We're not. Life expectancy is falling. And this is another clue. We're seeing that same increase in cancer in young people. And here's a group of young people where bowel cancer, one cancer in particular, has increased 4-fold since 1974. We have created a very sick society. Now, I'm sure that there are many of you who do not yet have these types of diseases, although the statistics tell us that over time, eventually, you will. The point to make here is that all of these diseases grow slowly, very, very slowly. They develop for decades in the body before they get so severe that they emerge with clinical symptoms. So you can lose bone for 30 years before you fracture. You can lose cartilage in your joints for a quarter century before you realize you have arthritis, and so on and so forth. And what we find is, we look at populations of healthy young people, turns out they're not so healthy at all. Because almost all of them have already in their bodies the seeds of those diseases that will go on in time to become clinically overt, which will make them sick and which will kill them. So this is NASH, which is the precursor to the liver disease I was referring to earlier. And when we look at healthy young populations, or they think they're healthy, we find that actually at least 1 in 5 of them already have developing liver disease. It's just not severe enough yet that they're aware of it. Nearly a third of healthy men and women have osteopenia. That is, they're moving gradually towards osteoporosis. They already have this disease that we call osteoporosis, but just in its early stages. And at least a fifth already have coronary artery disease. In fact, that figure is probably wrong. It's more like twice that. And at least a fifth of healthy middle-aged adults are already starting to dement. Not so much that they can't remember their names or where they live, but when we use sensitive tools, we can actually see their mental function is deteriorating. They are moving towards dementia. It's a kind of a gloomy picture when you realize that you all already have chronic degenerative disease, no matter how healthy you feel. But I think that you can flip that around. There's another way of looking at it, and that is that if you know that this is likely to be the case, and if you know what to do about it, you can take preventative action, and you can stop these problems ever coming to the surface. You can stop them from ever becoming clinical or from making you ill. And that is where the science has now arrived. So this is not just me saying all these ridiculous things. There's a lot of clinical scientists who have concluded the same, exactly the same thing. This is the Global Burden of Disease study, and a lot of very good medics and scientists are involved in this. They publish once a year, usually in The Lancet, and almost every year their conclusions are pretty similar. They say that most of cases of early, which means preventable death in most cases, are due to your lifestyle, and specifically your diet, what you eat. It is your diet that is killing you softly in all of these ways. Why don't we protest more about it? Well, maybe because it's making us more stupid, too. Have any of you seen the film Idiocracy by Mike Judge? You seen it? Funny film, isn't it? Turns out it was a documentary. There's a scene at the beginning of this film where they show IQ falling. And actually, it's very close to this graph, which is a real graph. It's a meta-analysis carried out by a guy called Domini and a bunch of his colleagues. They're pretty good at what they do. And what they have measured is, based on all the research that's been done in this area since 1898, when the first test was done, that our IQ has steadily fallen. This is pretty strong data. And since, as you can see here, in 1950, our IQ has fallen by an average of 15 IQ points. We are becoming measurably more stupid. And, you know, every generation thinks that it's a lot smarter than the one that went before. You know that, don't you? And those of you who are parents, you know that. You know, that's why we say to them, kids, leave home now while you still know everything. But the opposite is happening. They're actually less intelligent than we are or used to be. And the worrying thing here is I don't think the next generation of kids are going to be any better. That graph is going nowhere but down. And in fact, since this paper was printed, there's been some more data, and the preliminary analysis suggests we've lost another couple of IQ points. So we are kind of de-evolving. Intelligence got us this far, but I think the future scenario looks altogether different. Does it even matter? Because we're losing our ability to reproduce. Another meta-analysis, huge number of studies wrapped up into this, and since 1970, viable sperm counts have fallen by almost 2/3 all over the world. And on current trends, I mean, we're seeing huge numbers of people with subclinical fertility or infertility, male and female. On current trends, we're going to see population collapse within about 20, 25 years. And it won't be planned or pretty. It's likely to be extremely problematic, let me just say that. And I don't see one politician, either here or in North America or in Europe, that's got the backbone and the brain to take these problems on board and to do anything about them. Most of your politicians and mine are just whores for the lobby groups anyway. They don't represent us. If only they did. Because if they did, we could actually do something about these problems, because we actually know where they come from now. We know what to do about them. What the politicians should be studying, instead of electoral roles, instead of how to squeeze more taxes out of you, steal more from you, they should be looking at this. They should be looking at a map of the inflammatory sequence. This is a hugely simplified version of the reality, and you don't really need to know very much about this, although it fascinates geeks like me and my students and my colleagues. I'm going to concentrate only on the inflammasome. So forget about what happens inside the cell, look at what happens outside the cell and in the extracellular space, in the spaces between cells. Well, first of all, I got to tell you, you need to have some inflammation. Got to have the right amount, not too little, not too much. You've got to be in that Goldilocks zone. It's like, let's say it's a winter day here in Perth. You guys don't know what winter is. I used to live above the Arctic Circle. Where I came from, winter was minus 35, sometimes minus 40. Now that's cold. What you have is not really cold. And I see you walking around in puffer jackets and ski jackets. I don't know what they think you're doing. Anyway. So let's say you set a fire in the hearth of your living room. You just want enough to heat the room and make it comfortable. You don't want to burn the house down, right? So it's checks and balances. You need to be in the right zone. So it is with inflammation. You need to be able to start the inflammatory sequence, because that's how you defend yourself against pathogens or heal after tissue injury, but you don't want too much. So it turns out there's a brake and an accelerator. When you need to have some inflammation, this is the accelerator, omega-6 fatty acid, arachidonic acid. That gets the thing going. When you've had enough inflammation, the omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA, produce mediators which stop the inflammation. A healthy diet has got those in the right ratio. You can be immunocompetent, and you can be in a situation where you don't cause tissue destruction. We were designed to function well within a relatively broad range. But the problem is that this ratio is way out of whack now because of the food industry. So we have far too much omega-6, not enough of these omega-3s. So your foot is always on the gas pedal, on the accelerator. You're always driving that inflammatory sequence. We have too much of it. Instead of being acute and helpful, it's chronic, and it becomes very destructive. So this is what happens. The inflammasome, which is where the thing from the cell goes out into the extracellular space, you can divide it into two compartments. An upper one, and in a minute I'll show you the lower one. And it's in the upper one, the 6:3 ratio is really important, the accelerator and the brake. Now, under normal condition that works pretty well, but we now have a very high 6:3 ratio, and when we have a very high 6:3 ratio, the cell releases these little particles into the extracellular space. They're called exosomes, and that releases enzymes called matrix metalloproteases. That's the second phase, and now is when the tissue destruction starts. Now, because these enzymes are so destructive, if you're eating a healthy diet, it's going to be full of compounds called polyphenols, which you find in spices and fruits, and not so much in vegetables, to be quite honest. And what they do is they inhibit those enzymes, keep them under control. But the modern diet has taken away all of those safety factors. The modern diet has given us a very, very high 6:3 ratio. It's about 15:1 instead of being 2:1, which means that the top chamber of the inflammasome is overheating, and then the processed food diet, the modern diet, takes these things away too. So the second stage of the inflammasome is also overheating, and now your cells are pouring these matrix metalloprotease enzymes into the space between your cells. Now these are very important enzymes. We use them for certain things. It's like everything else, you need to have enough, not too many. Too many, they start dissolving you. They start turning you into soup. I think there's a Hungarian here, goulash. That's the equivalent. These enzymes destroy everything. They dissolve you. They literally dissolve you. This is what is produced by the flesh-eating bacteria. but we produce the same enzymes inside our bodies when we have chronic inflammation. So instead of dissolving and creating huge ulcers and destroying tissues, which it happens in a short term with flesh-eating microbes, if you're releasing smaller amounts of those enzymes over years, over decades into your tissues, that is what causes the progressive loss of healthy bone or cartilage or arterial lining. That is what contributes to the increasing death of neurons inside your skull as you move towards dementia. You do not want to have chronic inflammation. It's not a good idea. Because those extracellular proteins, those matrix metalloprotease enzymes, dissolve the extracellular matrix, which is this three-dimensional mesh of fibers that holds all your cells together. So there's collagen is one, that's a familiar one. There's many different kinds of collagen, but there's many other fibers as well. And this system is actually now considered to be an organ in its own right. It's a physiological system. Different types of fibers, different ratios in different parts of the bodies. It underpins the skin, for example. And the amount and health of the matrix determines the skin's thickness, its tensile strength, its elasticity, its ability to hold moisture, its hydration. When you lose the matrix, that's why the skin gets thinner, fragile, less elastic, less hydrated. That's what you call aging of the skin. It's entirely reversible, if you know how to do it. So this is the matrix that those enzymes dissolve. And if that matrix is being gradually destroyed over the years, then whatever tissue it is in will disintegrate and slowly die. And this is what the bulk of the aging process is, as we experience it today. And this is one of the core factors that drives chronic degenerative disease. Here's a little bit of information showing you how our ratio of 6s and 3s and polyphenols has changed. So for all the evidence that we have indicates that our 6-to-3 ratios have remained at about 2-to-1 for as long as we have records for, until in about 1900 that starts to change. 3s drop off the map because seafoods become less expensive, and just to give you a clue as to how much more expensive they've become. In the 1900s, oysters are given away for free in the coffee houses and ale bars. They're so plentiful. Where the bars now have bowls of peanuts on the bar, they used to have trays of oysters. They were given away for free. They were so cheap. That's changed a little. And the other good source of omega-3s, wild organic salmon, was so poor, so cheap, that again it was like the food of the poor. No anymore. Not anymore. Not anymore. And omega-6s have taken up because the food industry around about 1900 discovered a technology they could use to stabilize plant oils, give them a longer shelf life, and then they started pouring them into the food chain. So that really takes off. It's now 15-to-1 in Europe, 25-to-1 in North America. Polyphenol intake has fallen as well, dramatically. Partly because the foods we eat less of them. The foods themselves have changed. Their polyphenol content has been reduced. And partly because we eat a lot of processed foods rather than simple produce. So in an apple like this, or like this one for that matter, the polyphenols are in the skin to protect the fruit, and in the core to protect the DNA, which is why it's a good idea to eat fresh fruit. But if you eat a processed form of that apple, let's say you are ill-advised enough to consume a Mac apple pie. Not so good. What does industry do? They take off the peel, take out the core. All that is left is the pulp, which is cellulose and pectin, water and sugar. Then they add more sugar, and then they put preservatives in it, and they turn it into something that is no longer healthy at all. At all. So our levels of polyphenols in our diet have fallen dramatically, and this is the clue as to why we have so much more chronic degenerative disease, and these are the companies that bring it to you, because they have flooded the market with processed foods. Even although many of them, the smarter ones, and there are one or two smart politicians, know that these foods are actually not very good for you, and they prefer to eat altogether higher off the hog. These are processed foods for the poor, processed foods for the unrepresented, processed foods made artificially cheap because the lobby groups tell their politicians, we'd like some subsidies, please. And they're universally available. And for people who are cash poor or time poor, a lot of these foods are easy options. And they're difficult to resist because they're made to be addictive. The food industry is very good at doing that now. Now, none of these foods are acutely toxic. You could buy, for example, let's see if I can find an Australian product there somewhere. Do you have bonkers? That sounds Australian. You don't have those. Okay, let me see. Do you have wishbones? You poor, deprived people. Do you have nuts? All right. We've found common ground. You could leave this little discussion and on the way home buy yourself one of those nuts bars and go home tonight and eat it. And the odds are you'll wake up in the morning. It's not toxic in the acute sense. But if you eat large amounts of these foods for long periods of time, they will kill you. And I've got evidence for that, which I'll go through in a minute. They will make you ill before your time. They will kill you. They'll give you chronic degenerative disease because they cause chronic inflammation. Because, firstly, the 6-3 ratio is all wrong. Full of omega-6s, 3s have gone, so that's one anti-inflammatory nutrient gone. Polyphenols gone. 2 anti-inflammatory nutrients have gone. This is a third anti-inflammatory nutrient which prevents inflammation in the gut. That's gone. And then these have gone too, which means you have more chronic lingering infections, more chronic inflammation. 4 important anti-inflammatory nutrients gone, and industry then replaces them with these, which are compounds made when they process foods using their high temperature technologies. And these are highly pro-inflammatory. And then they give us lots and lots of sugar, far more than you even know is there, which also causes chronic inflammation. Not just sugar in cakes and confectionery, but in places where you would least expect it. Ketchup is really tomato jam. You don't taste the sugar because it's vinegar and spices. It covers all that up. There's a huge amount of sugar there. And then just to make matters even worse, they fill the foods full of salt, which means that your smooth muscle is too contractile, which means if you have inflammation in your arteries, the blood pressure goes up even more. Inflammation in the lungs, which many Australians have, through your asthma problem, the asthma becomes worse. So this is a food environment which is dominated by only a very small number of multinational players, almost designed to cause accelerated aging, disease, and death. And your politicians and ours have allowed this to happen. It is a diet that causes disease and death, and it also not only causes chronic inflammation, it starves you at the same time. Now that might seem counterintuitive, because not many people are starving today. But it starves you inwardly. Outwardly, you may seem to have enough calories or too much. Inwardly, you're starving. This is a diet that causes chronic malnutrition. That's why the Global Burden of Disease study was saying it's a poor diet that is the most important cause of death. But because these foods are full of calories but so low in nutrients, they create inner starvation, inner malnutrition. Now, medics usually refer to type A malnutrition, which is a deficiency of something like vitamin C and not enough calories, and they think, oh, well, that's malnutrition. The kid, typically in Africa, with kwashiorkor. We don't see that. We see type B malnutrition, where people are low in just about everything, because you're eating historically low amounts of food. And those foods are historically low in nutrients. And you have enough or too many calories. And that, luckily, we can pick that up too. We know exactly what that looks like. Looks like you. In fact, it looks like the inhabitant of any modern city. So they have chronic inflammation, and they have type B malnutrition, which most of you have. Which means, if you go back to that matrix, your economics are all skewed. Now, every living tissue is dynamic. It turns over constantly. If you're losing 10 arbitrary units of matrix a day and replacing 10 units, fine. You don't age. The matrix doesn't change. Skin doesn't age. Your bones don't weaken. The linings of your arteries stay supple. If you have chronic inflammation, you're now losing 15 units. And if you have type B malnutrition, you can only replace 5. So now you're losing 10 units of this matrix a day in whichever part of the body is affected, and it gets slowly less and less and less over time, like the erosion of a coastline. And now you are getting to the core of what chronic degenerative disease is. It's this combination of chronic inflammation and type B malnutrition. I said I'd show you some information as to how much this kills you. Well, more than you'd think. We've got a lot of data now which show, and all this is very recent, that the more of these processed and ultra-processed foods you eat, the more you get cancer, the more you die prematurely. And if you have 5 or 6 portions of these processed foods a day, it doubles your risk of early death. And it works not only in humans, but in other species as well. If we feed these processed foods to lab rats, they also get chronic degenerative disease, die early, accelerated aging, they die of sepsis, as we do when we eat these types of disease, these types of foods. And we eat so much of them, it is affecting so many of us that national life expectancy figures are starting to fall. I first saw this occurring in particularly vulnerable groups in the United States well before 2016. There are certain bellwether groups that are telling you that danger and negative things are coming. So I picked this up probably in about 2012. I could see the trend starting to form, but by 2016, it couldn't be hidden anymore. It was happening at the national level, and it's happened ever since. Life expectancy has been falling in the United States since then for all these kinds of things, including sepsis, just like those lab rats, plus diabetic complications, neurodegenerative disease, as I said earlier. And then more recently, the same thing started happening in Britain, and now we're going to start seeing the same trends in Germany, Ireland, Finland, Poland, and Australia, because this reflects the extent to which we eat these terrible foods. America consumes more of them than anyone else, close to 60%. Britain comes in at 52%, we're higher than that now. Then you have Ireland, Germany, Poland, and Finland. And Australia is pretty much in that group. And what this map is showing you is the effects on food consumption patterns of the food multinationals' juggernaut as they drive it from west to east and from north to south through Europe. And they have almost effectively obliterated the Mediterranean diet now. That will be almost gone altogether within the next few years. And there is some data from Germany, more or less, confirming that point. I won't go into that. So what do you do to look after yourselves, reduce your disease risk? You know about the Mediterranean diet, really good for you. More healthy option than anything the medical profession can give you. But we now know something even better. This is the Marquis Townsend, known to his contemporaries as Turnip Townsend, because he introduced a scheme of crop rotation involving turnips into Britain from Holland. His land was in Norfolk, which is the part of England that is closest to Holland. And laborers came over, and they were the people who actually talked about this innovation. He took the credit, but he and others like him introduced the agricultural revolution, which hugely increased agricultural productivity in Britain by almost tenfold. And round about this time, you have the Industrial Revolution, the development of the railways. So this huge agricultural cornucopia is being brought into the cities, which is where people live and where they work. And they work with their hands and with their backs. It's a lot of physical activity. It's all blue collar. And this has all been analyzed. We know this society very well. It documented itself. So we know how hard they worked, how long, how much they walked, what they did in their off time, which also involved physical activity. Their leisure hours were not spent watching the latest American soap. No television, no computer games, nothing like that. All of their leisure activities, most of them, involved physical activity as well. When you add it all up, it's about 60 to 75 hours of physical activity a week. And that meant they ate enormous amounts of calories. Women over 3,000, men up to 7,000 calories a day. And yet we can tell from the photographs, that was also the dawning of the age of photography, that they were very slim and very well muscled. They were consuming all those huge numbers of calories in physical activity. And what is it that they're eating? It's a really healthy diet. They drink beer, but it is small beer with an alcohol content of about 1, maybe 2%. They don't drink whiskey, vodka, rum, anything like that. The industrial method of continuous distillation doesn't arrive until 1898. They're not smoking, hardly at all. There is no commercial cigarette production. A few people smoke pipes, that's it. Lots of omega-3s, very little omega-6, lots of polyphenols, no chronic inflammation. It's really a very healthy diet indeed. it's a super Mediterranean diet, and if we think the Mediterranean diet is healthy, then this diet should be even healthier. Now, just a little thing for the geeks here. You know, if you draw graphs, if you make up graphical information, we have today, we're pretty sick, we have the Victorians, they're better than the Mediterranean diet people, they're better. That's just 2 data points, right? You can't draw a line with 2 points. You need to have a minimum of 3. What happens if, okay, here we are, we're this sick, the Mediterranean people are that sick, they're better off. What happens if you increase your nutrient intake even further? Do you get further improvements? Is there a rebound? Are some of these nutrients anti-nutritional, perhaps? Some of my conservative colleagues say, well, maybe they could be. Well, now we have that 3rd data point. It is the mid-Victorian period. And guess what? When you increase your intake of these nutrients further, you get even healthier. So we do life comparisons. We look at life expectancy, which is a crude indicator of health. And if you do your comparisons, you see women have gained about 3 years since the 19th century, which is everything to do with family planning and improved gynecology and obstetrics. But men have lost 3 years. And we have gone backwards. We have lost 3 years despite modern medicine, surgery, diagnostics, despite the proliferation of medical facilities that cover our land like a cancer. They have done nothing to improve public health. They have done nothing to improve our individual health. The Victorians didn't die in the way that we do. We die very slowly and very expensively, and we are a burden to ourselves and to our carers. The Victorians remain completely healthy until the end and then die very quickly, very often in large numbers in epidemics, which is actually a lot cheaper. Yeah, this is the cold science of mediconomics. This is the kind of thing that our politicians pay attention to. They don't really want you living longer and drawing a pension for longer. It doesn't work out for them. That's one of the reasons we have gone down this road. They would far rather you worked until you were 65 and then died reasonably quickly. They'll give you 5 years on average. That's what they would like to see. If they could speed that process up, believe me, they would. So they don't die in the way that we do. They go to workhouses when they get too old to work in the farms or the factories. And that actually meant they had to work to pay for their own upkeep. And the records tell us they did. They were able to work. They were still competent until the last days or sometimes hours before they died. So they died typically very quickly and usually of an infection, a fulminating infection, fulminating, that's medical speak for overwhelming. But when we look at what they died of, and we had access to thousands and thousands and thousands of records, they didn't have much degenerative disease. Remember, they're living as long as we do, but they just don't get it to anything like the same extent. They have 90% less cancer than we do, 90% less heart disease, 90% less diabetes, 90% less dementia. The list goes on and on and on. Which has 2 clear messages. Firstly, it tells us 90% of this enormous burden of disease that we see today, that touches so many of you, is unnecessary and avoidable. And this figure of 10% is interesting in another way, because if you ask a cardiologist or a cancer specialist or a neurogeriatrician how many of your patients have strong genetic risk factors, they almost always say it's about 10%. We think this means that in that period, the only people who had these diseases were the people who had really strong genetic risk factors. Everybody else was protected. We have lots of other evidence to support that. I don't have time to go into all that now, unfortunately. But this is a tabulation produced by other scientists. This is 1997. 2/3 of us die from cancers and cardiovascular, cerebrovascular diseases. If you go back to the 19th century, it's only a very tiny number, about 10% of what we see now. So it looks as if the bulk of all of these conditions that we worry about, that affect us, that are so problematic towards the end of our lives, it looks as if they could all be avoided. And when we presented these data, the medical profession was extremely critical. I would go to conferences, I would get shouted down quite literally, because the implications of the work that I and my colleagues had done was that a century of medical progress had achieved nothing at all. that we hadn't improved people's quality of lives, that we hadn't improved people's life expectancy at all. And those graphs that they sometimes show you of increasing life expectancy actually are a comprehensive lie. Any statistician should be able to see through them. Almost all of that increase is due to reduced infant mortality. A 60-year-old in 1900 could expect to live as many more years as a 60-year-old can now. In fact, slightly more. So that statistic that people say everyone's living longer is pretty bogus when you get right down to it. And the doctors would ask me, well, why is it, if anything that you're saying is correct, how is it possible that they could have been so cancer-free and that we are so prone to cancer? And so we went back to the drawing board, we looked at the machinery, and we looked at all of these factors which are important. And what we found was that all of them in the Victorian were protective, and all of them, because of our different lifestyle, our different physiology, our different diets, is no longer protective, but vulnerable. All our many defenses against cancer have been degraded by the modern diet. Now, cancer cells are probably forming in your body every day. If they form in the body of a Victorian, they have nowhere to go. Their chances of succeeding, in their terms, in other words, becoming a clinical cancer, are negligible. If that same cancer cell emerges in the body of a 21st century person, because those defenses are down, the chances that that cancer will succeed and prosper and multiply and go on to become a clinical problem are far, far greater, and that is why we have so much more cancer. And we've done the same kind of analysis for all of the other chronic degenerative diseases. So here you have Mr. Average, who's eating a processed food, modern diet, and because he is, his 6-to-3 ratio is very high, not enough polyphenols, so he has chronic inflammation, he has arthritis, coronary artery disease, he may have non-alcohol related fatty liver disease. He may have asthma or chronic bronchitis. He may have chronic obstructive lung disease. He's more likely to be depressed. He's more likely to have neurodegenerative disease. All of these are conditions where we know chronic inflammation is involved. But because he's eating a modern diet, he's also eating a diet that is low in these prebiotic fibers, which means he also has chronic inflammation in the intestines. And of course, this is what we see as practitioners. We see this too. So what should we do to such a subject? Well, we could shoot him full of pharmaceuticals, a strategy which is not going to cure anything, and may well send him into hospital, if not to an early grave, because we kill a lot of our patients with these so-called magic bullets, which are actually surprisingly toxic. Or we could get to the root of the problem and alleviate these nutritional abnormalities. We could give him a combination of omega-3s and fat-soluble polyphenols, which is what he needs. And that, in many cases, is enough to dampen down or even banish the chronic inflammation. And when we do that, what we find is that degenerative disease, the symptoms start to become less, and over time, the disease very often will go into remission. But we will also give this person prebiotic fibers which restore the microbiome. And when you do that, what you find is that the inflammation in the colon, in the intestines, also start to fade away. And instead of being pathological, disease-causing, become physiological. That is a much lower level of inflammation, which you actually need to maintain in the intestines, because that's part of the way in which you differentiate yourself from the outside world. Bit of science there. I'll go into it in detail later as interested afterwards. The prebiotics, I haven't really talked about them, and I think I probably have to explain them. You've heard of dysbiosis. What is it? Well, our guts are full of gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria. Not all positives are good, not all negatives are bad, but the difference between them is that the negatives are negative because they're coated with polysaccharide, lipopolysaccharide, which is pro-inflammatory. So you don't want to have too many of them. Now these are the gram-positive bacteria, which are not pro-inflammatory. And if you eat prebiotic fibers, your microbiome has lots of these things, which is good. They're healthy because they remain in the lumen of the gut and they live in the outer layer of the mucous bed. They don't come into contact with our colonocytes, the cells that line the colons. They're not invasive. And these bacteria are actually producing a metabolite called butyrate, which is anti-inflammatory. So this is a very healthy anti-inflammatory configuration. This is a healthy microbiome. Take those prebiotic fibers away, the gram-positive bacteria are starved, they're replaced by gram-negative. Now the butyrate, the anti-inflammatory, is gone. Now the gut is filling up with lipopolysaccharide, which is pro-inflammatory. And so now the conversation between the microbiome and your own cells is no longer healthy, it is destructive. Because these gram-negative microbes destroy the mucosal barrier, come into direct contact with the colonocytes, and unlike the gram-positive bacteria, which are saying, don't be inflamed, don't be cancerous, these gram-negative species are saying, be inflamed, be cancerous. Which is one reason why we have so many problems. Simplest thing to do is to put prebiotic fibers back into the diet where they always used to be, restore the microbiome, bring it back to gram-positive, go from pro-inflammatory back to anti-inflammatory. And you can do it with fibers like this. It's a carbohydrate, but not one that you can digest. It passes intact through the small intestine. It doesn't get broken down to blood sugar. It goes into the colon, becomes food for the microbes. They break it down into short-chain fatty acids, including butyrate, which is a very, very good thing. So this is a very short-chain fiber, and the microbes eat it from one end all the way to the other. And because it's such a short molecule, 1 gram of phos will contain a lot of ends, a lot of short fibers. So the fermentation, which is how the microbes consume it, is very rapid. So we have to add it to longer fibers, including inulin, which is the same but longer. This is 1,3,1,4-beta-glucans from oats, longer, even slower. The resistant starch or resistant dextrins, larger molecules, even slower. And you need to have fast, medium, slow, and very slow fibers because in the gut, everything moves. So this blend passes through the small intestine and then gets into the large intestine, and it's fast fibers start the fermentation. They start the shift from gram-negative to gram-positive. And then the next fibers take over, the inulin, and then the 1,3,1,4-beta-glucans, and then the resistant starch. It's a timed release system, like a relay race. And in this way, we change the microbiome throughout the entire large intestine. And when you do that, the inflammation goes away. Now, WHO says you should all be eating more fiber. And if you eat enough, it'll reduce the risk of premature death by 30%. Here's the breakdown. And they say you should eat 30 fibers. That's about adequate, but if you eat more, there's more protection. Problem is, our average intake is 15 grams of fiber, not nearly enough. They give you this advice, but it's useless. What you need are the prebiotic fibers. The other fibers simply won't do the trick. It's the prebiotic fibers that treat the dysbiosis and make you feel good. So what are we eating? 15 grams of fiber a day. Only a quarter of that is prebiotic. The WHO says eat double that. And what we've done is go one better. In our blended prebiotic, the dose is 12 grams. And we think that will give you the same advantages that the WHO have published. In fact, more, considerably more. And what we see is huge improvements in the condition of our patients and clients who decide to go down this route. There's 2 other major sources of chronic inflammation. One is deep abdominal adipose tissue. Apple shape, you know it's bad for you? Because it's that kind of fat that creates inflammation. It's invaded by macrophages. Bad news. So 2 things you can do: get thin, which is difficult, or stabilize it with some very special micronutrients, including carotenoids and xanthophylls and lipophile polyphenols. Details don't matter, but all of those have been put into another formulation called Extend, which also contains everything else that you need to alleviate and reverse type B malnutrition. One final problem, one final frontier, one more source of chronic inflammation. And it's not mobile phones, it's not stress, it's periodontal disease. Brush your teeth, spit into the sink, spot of blood, you have periodontal disease. You have chronic inflammation in the mouth, you have dysbiosis in the mouth. You're looking worried. come and talk to me afterwards. If you have periodontal disease, it might seem trivial to you, but it's actually very serious. It increases the risk of Parkinsonism and Alzheimer's, and we think that inflammatory mediators and bacterial metabolites are getting into the brain through the olfactory nerve. Because this is happening in the mouth, you're swallowing these compounds in the saliva, and that's why periodontal disease, we think, is associated with an increased risk of various cancers, including breast and prostate, resistant hypertension, and probably coronary artery disease. So we would like to do something about this. You can go to your dentist to have your teeth scraped, which is really a horrible thing to do, or there may be a better way, a less painful way, and I've been looking for one for a long time. About 5 years ago, I found a group of compounds in microalgae, seaweeds. When you pick up seaweed out of the ocean, first thing you notice is it's slippery. It's very slippery. They're coated with non-stick compounds, and it turns out that those compounds are fucoidans and funorans. They're present in edible seaweeds. This is a seaweed that's eaten, it's baked into bread in Ireland. It's eaten in other parts of the world, including Scandinavia, Scophilum nodosum. Sounds like something out of Harry Potter, but it's a seaweed. And if you eat this seaweed, you absorb these compounds, they get into the blood, they get into the saliva, they bathe the roots of the teeth with these non-stick compounds, and when you do that, the bacteria, the plaque and the tartar simply fall off your teeth. And you can see that for yourself by measuring the plaque with plaque disclosure tablets, which you get from your dentist. And if you keep on using these products, 2 or 3 weeks later, the tartar drops off your teeth as well. And you can do this for yourself. You can also give it to your cats and dogs, because it works in animals too. Exactly the same principle. And when you do that, the inflammation, the dysbiosis in the mouth disappears, and then the risk factors, we think, for brain disease and for other diseases in the body also go away. And this is going to be in the next version, the next generation of Extend, which I mentioned before. So this is the first attempt to generate a systematic approach to the problems of type B malnutrition and chronic inflammation. Just 3 products, 3 delivery systems, because they're such different compounds. You can't put them into one delivery. It's just not possible. So inflammation in the tissues, it's this combination of omega-3s and lipophile polyphenols. In the gut, the blended prebiotics. And in the deep fat in the abdomen, and in periodontal disease, and for type B malnutrition, that is the answer to that. So it's very simple, surprisingly effective, and unlikely to subject your patient to the risk of harm, which is the Hippocratic Oath I signed up to when I went to medical school. First, do no harm. But anyone here who is a doctor or a medical professional, you know that we often do harm our patients. And we don't ever cure them, unless they have a bacterial infection which is still not resistant to the antibiotics we use. We're beginning to move into the next generation, the next paradigm of healthcare. We're now starting to think of these things in terms of curative strategies, and despite being highly effective strategies which are entirely safe. We think the pharmaceutical industry was interesting. We think that approach is largely wrong. We think that over the next few years it will become progressively more redundant. And as it does, public health, your health, the health of your communities, the people you love, is going to improve.